Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Today's episode is a difficult one because I'm talking about children and some very disturbing realities for children of the 1800s. So I just want to give a specific warning for this episode. It includes themes related to violence against children and pedophilia. So if you're someone who finds these topics triggering, please just be aware that they will be discussed. Today, we're talking about the deeply disturbing world of Victorian children's stories and the twisted origins of some nursery rhymes of the time that we still enjoy today. The 1830s to the dawn of the 20th century was a prolific era for literature, poetry, and songs intended to scare the daylights out of children and adults alike. Many children's stories are cautionary tales, lessons in etiquette. Some are lessons about right and wrong. Some serve little purpose other than to terrify children into obedience. Some appear written by people desperately trying to understand their own childhood trauma. And some are just sick musings from clearly disturbed people. How did these messed up fantasies about tragic deaths, cannibalism, mutilation, sexual violence, grisly murders, and illicit drug use make their way into children's stories? The same way all of those things made their way into every aspect of culture in the Victorian era. Adults and children couldn't get enough of it. I'm going to talk about the ways Victorian society viewed children and portrayed them in stories. We'll touch on penny dreadfuls, the little books of horror that sold for a penny, the creepy and real origins of a few of the era's most disturbing nursery rhymes. I personally thought I knew a number of these, but was totally mistaken, so I'll correct some common misconceptions. I'll give some examples of truly chilling bedtime stories, the unsanitized, undisneyfied versions, and discuss a few very upsetting facts about one of the most famous Victorian children's stories of all, Alice in Wonderland. I will happily debate anyone about what is the most terrifying movie of all time. I truly believe it is the 1985 made-for-TV movie, Alice in Wonderland. Carol Channing's White Queen still haunts my dreams. Something important to note when talking about the horror of children's fiction at this time was that although to us, stories of children being mauled by animals and falling out of trees and dying and bursting into flames may seem very inappropriate and traumatizing, but the terror that children of this time dealt with on a day-to-day basis was far worse than any fictional story you can find. These were days where child labor laws were scant at best, and children were full-time employees of some of the deadliest industries, such as chimney sweeping, mining, and factory work, where safety regulations were virtually non-existent. A law did pass in 1819 called the Cotton Mills and Factories Act that stated that no children under 9 were to be employed, and children from 9 to 16 were limited to 12 hours a day. This only applied to the cotton industry, though, and very few, if any, other laws protected children outside of that industry. In fact, those protective laws were hardly enforced, if you could even call them protections. Of course, smaller children were still employed, especially for jobs where climbing under moving machinery were required, and they could be as young as 5 and work 14 hours a day. Over 50% of the workers in British factories in the 1800s were under the age of 14. They were frequently scalped, crushed, maimed, blinded, and poisoned. And that was just their day job. Even children lucky enough to avoid full-time employment in cotton mills had to contend with 6 epidemics of the century. Most of these little guys were just trying to survive, and tales of other kids or grown-ups surviving by the skin of their teeth, or not, because of a mistake that maybe they made, a choice they chose, especially when it had a catchy tune or colorful illustrations, must have brought a little comfort, which I know may sound weird. But I have to admit, I myself find a strange comfort in horror, especially horror movies and true crime. There's something about putting yourself in a scary situation, like reading a spooky book or watching a scary movie, where you're in control. You can close the book. You can turn off the movie if you get too scared. You've got a fourth wall between you and Freddy Krueger. It almost feels like you're preparing for and learning about how to survive if he ever shows up in your dreams. You don't want to be caught off guard, and the more you know, the more you at least feel you could escape if you had to. There's also a great deal of comfort in knowing that you're not the only one afraid of something, and being courageous doesn't mean you're not afraid. It's not too difficult to see why kids of this time and today, and big kids like me, would want to experience some of these feelings or just experience the thrill of it. To some, spookiness is just simply fun. My best friend told me recently that her little boy is obsessed with vampires and last words. A good friend of hers recently passed away, and her little guy was so concerned about what her last words were and how important it was that she find out and let him know. She has no idea where this comes from. He's a child after my own heart, and he would have been in great company in the 1800s. Kids in general truly loved all manner of horror. Interestingly, there was a notable difference in themes between children's stories from the 16 to 1700s and the 1800s. In the preceding era, you find a lot more examples of children actually surviving terrible things and being empowered in the end. They push the witch into the oven that tried to eat them. Cinderella, who was practically a child in that story, marries the prince, and her stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by doves. They didn't mention that in the Disney movie for some reason. Jack cuts the beanstalk before he reaches the ground, and the giant comes crashing down, and little 12-year-old Clara helps defeat the 7-headed Mouse King and marries the Nutcracker. That's how the original story ends. She is 12. The original versions of these stories were all written before 1830. After 1830 and until the early 1900s, you don't find a lot of happily ever afters for kids in fairy tales. There was a contradictory perception of children in this age. They're depicted as innocent creatures who should be protected from monsters and abusive adults. Their cherubness and innocence was emphasized in illustrations, advertisements, magazines, calendars, tea towels, wallpaper, stationery, and soapboxes. There was an unsettling cult of the child described by poet Ernst Dawson. He described this as a good thing, by the way, viewing children as an object of worship. And although the descriptions of children by artists and poets in this part of society were generally religious in nature, it's impossible to ignore the pedophilic aspects of their obsession as well. Artists of this society and poets describe men pursuing children instead of women, like in J.M. Barrie's The Little White Bird. And that poet, Ernst Dawson, he proposed to a 14-year-old named Adelaide, having groomed her since she was 11. So, child worship never seems to be a positive thing in any time, no matter how angelic or precious they're made out to be. Child pageantry comes to mind as a lingering issue in our day for me, personally. On the other hand, there was also a great vilification of children in this time. Many Victorians accepted what was called the law of recapitulation, which posited that children, as they grow, follow the same stages of the human race. In other words, children begin as savages, but we're not talking about cavemen. They were talking about Adam and Eve, the original sinners, the OGs. It was a belief that children were born evil. They needed to be beaten, punished, corrected, and bent into beneficial, good members of society. So this may be why we see this clash of innocent, angelic children in storytelling of the day, who then get killed in terrible ways for not doing what they're told or crying so hard they cry their eyes out. That's in a story called The Crybaby from the book Slovenly Betsy. Or, of course, there's Goldilocks, written in 1837, an angelic little girl with golden curls that sneaks into a bear's house, eats their food, sits in their chairs, and falls asleep. In the original, the bears find her. They rip her to pieces, and they eat her when they get home. There's also a second known original of the story where she wasn't a little girl, but an old woman who jumps out the window when the bears come home, and she breaks her neck. Perfect. There was also plenty of contempt for older women in Victorian children's stories, but that's a whole other podcast in itself. Let's now talk about the fascinating world of penny dreadfuls. These 12 or so page stories were similar to comic books of today. They were illustrated stories that cost only a penny, that were full of horror, bad kids, mayhem, vampires, drug addicts, grave robbers, murderers, and adventurers running into sticky situations. One of the most popular ones of the day was Varney the Vampire, also called Feast of Blood. It was first published in 1845. Like Dracula, Varney hunted young, beautiful women and was undeniably sexual, and included some of the now common vampire tropes of the sympathetic vampire, one who's angered and ashamed of his desires, but finds himself enslaved by them nonetheless. There were 109 weekly issues of this particular book in 1847. Other characters in these mini-books were Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, who first appeared in the 1846 penny dreadful called The String of Pearls, and Spring-Heeled Jack, who was a fire-breathing devil man who could jump abnormally high. This character was based on a terrifying string of real occurrences in London in 1837. People in London began making reports of a ghost, imp, or devil in the shape of a large white bull that would harass and terrorize women, primarily, as it were. This person, or ghoul, would ring a doorbell, and when they answered, he or it would start ripping their clothes to pieces with large claws. He would also ambush people on the street. Eventually, it was theorized that this wasn't one person, but a few that just likely wanted to terrorize the neighborhood for fun. But all of the weird crimes and terrifying nature of these random events were perfect inspiration for the penny dreadful stories for children that followed. And children really did love them. They were marketed to children. Many of the stories included children too. There was a very popular one about a young character named Jack Harkaway. His story starts in 1871 and was first mentioned in a story called Jack Harkaway's School Days. It's all about him running away, jumping on a ship, and following a life of adventure and mayhem. His pranks would often get him into a lot of trouble, where he'd end up having to fight wild animals like a 15-foot python. Kids loved his books as much as kids love Harry Potter today. Kids loved these stories so much that they formed little book clubs, and they'd pass them around to kids who didn't have a penny to pay. Or kids would just read, those that could, to other kids in a group. They were definitely used as a way of bonding between kids. Apart from their jobs being at times terrifying, they were mostly incredibly boring and monotonous. These insane stories must have been so exciting for these kids. But just like any media that isn't considered entirely wholesome by especially religious pockets of society, these books were dismissed as trash. Or worse, they were believed to be influencing children to become monsters, and they were considered the cause of crime. Like Elvis, or video games, or Twisted Sister, or even Harry Potter. These have all been blamed for causing social rot. I wonder what was blamed in like Genghis Khan's days. What music was he listening to? Okay, story time. Allow me to tell you some of these horrible stories and nursery rhymes. I won't read them all in full, but I'll give you the very upsetting synopsises. This one's called The Three Children Sliding on Ice. It begins, 3 children sliding on the ice. Upon a summer's day, as it fell out, they all fell in, the rest they ran away. Oh, had these children been at school, or sliding on dry ground, 10,000 pounds to 1 penny, they had not then been drowned. Ye parents who have children dear, and ye too who have none, if you would keep them safe abroad, pray keep them safe at home. All right, Why is there ice on a summer's day? That's mysterious. But as for the rest of it, I take this as a cautionary tale for children not to slide around on ice in general, but especially when they should be at school instead. It's also a cautionary tale to parents to, prevent your children from ever leaving the house, homeschool. Now this next one is painfully beautiful by William Allingham, called The Fairies. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again, her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back between the night and morrow. They thought that she was fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. They have kept her ever since, deep within the lake, on a bed of flag leaves, watching till she wake. I don't think that one needs much explanation. It's just heartbreaking. Ring Around the Rosie. You probably already know this one by heart. Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Isn't this one about the plague of London of 1665? No, that's actually not true. You may have heard the theory that in this rhyme, the ring around the rosy refers to a rash, pockets full of posies to mask the smell of rotting flesh, and ashes, ashes is just an iteration of achoo, like sneezing from sickness, and we all fall down just means we all fall down dead. No, that's not true. The first version of this rhyme can be traced only to 1881. Snopes traced the real origin and discovered that it's more likely referring to the religious banning of dancing among many Protestants in the 1800s. It's most likely attributed to children trying to find a loophole in these dancing bans. Children would play what are called ring games, where they do exactly what we do when we sing that little song. We all hold hands and spin around together and we all fall down. I wouldn't call that dancing, and neither did they. Spinning around in a circle, falling over, and giving yourself a concussion was fair game. What are all the literal references in the rhyme about? It's tough to say. There doesn't seem to be any info on that. However, there are different kinds of rose bushes, specifically some called rosies. There are also rambling rosies, clustered crimson roses. Maybe they were literally making a rhyme about holding hands and making a ring around a rose bush. Who can say? But it wasn't a reference to a rash. That much we do know. A German psychiatrist in 1845 released a book of his cautionary tales for children, and they were bizarre and traumatizing. This one in particular, Little Suck-a-Thumb, it's a story about a child that's told not to suck his thumb while his mother is away, because the creepy tailor will come by and cut his thumbs off with scissors. And sadly, he doesn't do as his mother says. Other stories in this book include a kid who didn't eat his soup, so he starved to death, and a little girl plays with matches and bursts into flames. Child psychology must have been its own kind of nightmare in these days. I don't know anything about that. Gonna save that for another podcast. Quick note about Rumpelstiltskin. The story of a woman trapped in a room until she can spin straw into gold. If you don't remember, this little weirdo Rumpelstiltskin shows up and says he can spin the straw into gold if she gives him her firstborn. She agrees. He does it. But when it's time to come collect, she just can't give the baby up. So Rumpelstiltskin says, if you can guess my name, you can keep your baby. She overheard him herself singing his name to himself earlier in the story, so she says it. He gets really mad and stomps off. This was actually how the original story went, but the writer decided to do an update to it that made it disgusting. Rumpelstiltskin gets so angry that he shoves one leg into the ground, grabs the other leg, and rips himself in half. And the lady and the baby live happily ever after. Okay, let's talk about the real Little Mermaid. This is a story written in 1836 in Copenhagen by Hans Christian Andersen. It was found in a book called Fairy Tales for Children. And here's how this fairy tale for children actually ended before Disney had its way with it. In the original, she doesn't marry the prince. She watches the prince marry another princess, and she gets heartbroken. A pair of mermaid sisters offer her a knife to kill him with, and she's like, perfect. She thinks about it, but she decides not to kill him after all, and instead decides to jump into the ocean, and when she does, she turns into sea foam. Beautiful children's tale. Finally, let's talk about some deeply disturbing facts about the most famous children's story of all time, Alice in Wonderland. This was a story about a little girl who falls down a rabbit hole and comes in contact with a lot of zany characters, all of whom have serious mental illnesses or addictions. These are all quite upsetting. Firstly, Lewis Carroll, the writer of Alice in Wonderland, had a very disturbing interest in young children. He was known to primarily befriend children as young as 10, and he didn't really have many adult acquaintances. He would write these children letters. In one letter to a colleague's child, he thanks her for a lock of her hair that she gave him, and he says, "I have kissed it several times, for want of having you to kiss. You know, even hair is better than nothing." End quote. He befriended the 3 young children of the Dean of Christ Church at Oxford, one of them being Alice, that inspired the stories. I hate any time I read that Carroll was a lover of photography or an avid photographer of children. He created child pornography, specifically of little girls, some fully naked and others partially, including little Alice and her sisters. He wrote, "I confess I do not admire naked boys in pictures. They always seem to me to need clothes, whereas one hardly sees why the lovely form of girls should ever be covered." Sounds so innocent, doesn't it? No man takes naked photos of children and keeps them in his home that isn't sick. The relationship with his family ended abruptly, and there isn't any historical evidence why, and he never saw Alice again after she turned 12. There is a theory that he asked the 12-year-old Alice to marry him. He was in his 30s, but there isn't any evidence for that either. Alice did marry later in life, not to him. She had 3 sons, 2 of which died in the First World War after her husband died in 1926. God damn it, this poor girl. Let's now talk about something that some see as upsetting, but I actually think is one of the best lessons you can give a kid through storytelling. It's the element of nihilism. Throughout the story, things just happen. They make no sense. It is a meaningless puzzle. Things are really chaotic. You get a sense of it doesn't matter what you do sometimes. Problems don't always have easy solutions or any solutions at all. As far as dark morals of stories, I'm all for this one. But back to the upsetting stuff. So in regard to the mental illnesses and drug addictions many of these characters are said to possess, some folks like to attribute very specific mental illnesses to each of them, but almost all of these mental illnesses were not very understood at the time, or even existed yet as known illnesses or personality disorders. The Queen of Hearts is often said to have a narcissistic personality disorder. No one knew what narcissism was at this time. Lewis Carroll certainly didn't. And in fact, it wasn't until 1889 that psychiatrists Paul Nacke and Havelock Ellis first used this term to describe a personality disorder. So I think people are kind of reaching a little bit when they call the Cheshire Cat schizophrenic, for example. But that doesn't mean that they're not all very messed up. The caterpillar sits on a mushroom smoking a hookah and tells Alice to eat some magic mushrooms to alter her body size. Does this mean he's a drug addict? Well, he's not doing drugs in a child's story and enticing a child to also do them, so we can just leave it there, I think. We don't need to diagnose the guy. It's messed up enough as it is. The White Rabbit does appear to be very anxious, manic, and at times aggressive. Does this mean he has generalized anxiety disorder, as some folks say he represents? Not necessarily. It just means he's a very unstable, unsettling children's book character, that's for sure. And then there's the Mad Hatter. Okay, this is interesting. Incorrectly believed to be a hatter who has inhaled too much mercury. Mercury salts were used to soak the felt in hats at the time, and they still did not know the dangers of mercury poisoning at that time. But a lot of hatters developed tics, twitches, tremors, and all manner of neurological issues because of it, causing some to associate mental illness with hatters. But there's a coincidence here. When Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland, the effects of mercury poisoning were not known to be an issue specific to hatters. Yes, hatters got sick, but so did everybody else in their incredibly hazardous jobs. Not to mention, mercury was still being used as a treatment for syphilis, which was very common at the time. So everyone's noses were falling off, their brains were melting left and right. So again, this was not, at least at the time Alice in Wonderland was written, something thought of as an issue specific to hatters. There was a term, mad as an adder, referring to an Anglo-Saxon term for viper that may have morphed its way into the term mad as a hatter after Alice in Wonderland was written. But again, the fact that hatters did develop terrible neurological conditions had nothing to do with the inspiration for the character. It's just a coincidence that a lot of hatters did develop terrible mental and neurological problems. There actually is, though, a specific mental illness attributed to the story, literally called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, or AIWS. It's a condition of disorientation which affects size perception, specifically of body parts. Lewis Carroll actually had that syndrome himself. And now you can use all those tidbits to impress all of your friends at your next Twisted Trivia Night. Well, that was all really upsetting. I hope you're okay. Here is something to make you feel a little bit better. It's a sweet little children's poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson from the time. What does little birdie say in her nest at peep of day? Let me fly, says little birdie. Mother, let me fly away. Birdie, rest a little longer till the little wings are stronger. So she rests a little longer, then she flies away. What does little baby say in her bed at peep of day? Baby says, like little birdie, let me rise and fly away. Baby, sleep a little longer till the little limbs are stronger. If she sleeps a little longer, baby too shall fly away. If you want to hear more from me about these terrible things, rate, review, and subscribe. Be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you in your nightmares.